This lecture concerns modernism. Modernism is not just an idea that we would think of in our own time as being current. It is actually like other eras in history, a moniker for a particular era. In fact, you have probably heard of modernism in reference to furniture design of the, say, 1950s or so, Danish modern or modern furniture. And you've probably encountered, intellectually at least, the discussion of postmodernism. Well, to have postmodernism, you have to have had modernism in the past. So modernism is a, let me bring up this other slide, is a social and intellectual movement of the 20th century that was a way of incorporating and emerged from, as a philosophical system, emerged from the Second Industrial Revolution that we call the Gilded Age, that emerged from the burgeoning mass consumption economy, which was based on economic concepts that had not existed prior to the early 20th century, and that was based on a change in a value structure from defining the good life as having something to do with what you produce to defining the good life as having to do with what you could buy. Another background of the modernist movement was urbanization. That change, like I alluded to in the lecture about World War I, from a rural majority to an urban majority society in the United States. Also, the carnage and the shock of that first great industrial war, the World War I or the Great War, set up modern culture and gives it some of its particular and even peculiar angles, outlook on the world. Let's look at some of the intellectual background of modernism. The strands of intellect that we see in modernism come from these four different intellectual ideas, intellectual thrusts, you might say. In the mid-19th century, philosophers and theologians like David Strauss and Ludwig Feuerbach began what is called the higher criticism of the Bible. That is, Strauss and Feuerbach made pretty cogent and well-accepted arguments that the Bible was not the inerrant word of God, that it was principally a guide for living, as well as a history of the relationship between the Hebrew people and the deity. That there was nothing inherently bad about the Bible, but that it was not something to be thumped, that it was mostly allegories, mostly stories, many apocryphal, and that you had to build a theology and a philosophy around this idea that the Bible was a batch of analogies and a batch of stories and histories that were not literally true. Another component of the intellectual background of modernism is evolutionary biology or Darwinism. Now, do not confuse Darwin's evolutionary biology with social Darwinism. The only thing that those two philosophical traits have in common is the word Darwin. Social Darwinism is a severe perversion of Darwin's evolutionary biology. Darwin was not trying to make a statement about society. He was trying to talk about how one species, um, why there was differentiation among species and how species came to exist. Um, but the impact of Darwin's evolutionary biology on modernism is that it emphasized biology as a model for making sense of society. It emphasized that rather than the universe being mechanistic, that it was organic, that things grew from other things or from common ancestors. Prior to Darwin's theory of evolution catching on and influencing modernism and influencing thought in the 19th and 20th century so heavily, it was Isaac Newton's conception of the universe as a watch, that everything, including human beings, ran like watches, and that society ran like a watch. And all you had to do was to figure out the rules of how the watch worked, and you could figure out what had happened and what was going to happen. Well, Darwin's theory of evolution was a different way of looking at humans, a different way of looking at science, a different way of looking at society, that change occurred and change equaled progress. Now, this isn't inherent in Darwinism. This is the way that moderns picked up on Darwinism and used it to organize the way they thought about the world. That is, that biology would be the model, not mechanics, that things were in life were organic and that they changed, and that change meant progress. So these are some of the backgrounds of modernism. Freud's psychology, which really came to the fore in the 1920s in the United States, at least, was a major impetus behind the worldview of moderns, and that is Freud emphasized the unconscious mind, that people were influenced by things that they didn't realize they were influenced by. And he also emphasized the inherent power of irrationalism. This is not the inherent power of emotions over intellect. This is the inherent power of the irrational, uncontrolled mind influencing human behavior. Finally, there's Einstein's theory of relativity, that much like the higher criticism of the Bible, yanked the rug out of certainty, out from under certainty, by saying that objective truth in a scientific sense, in an astrophysics sense, does not necessarily exist, that the way that a person would perceive truth has to do with their perspective at the moment. This is not situational ethics. This is not what Einstein was talking about. Situational ethics is a serious perversion of Einstein's relativity. He's not saying blithely and glibly that everything's relative. That's just silly. What he's saying is that the perspective of the observer of a set of, he's talking about astrophysics, that the perspective of the observer is important in determining the truth of something, and that that things change according to the perspective of that observer. Now, all of these things, whether you agree with them or not, all of these things influenced what we might call the modern temper. They also began in the 1920s because of the shock of World War I and because of the burgeoning economy, and particularly the mass economy of the 1920s, the mass consumption economy. Then we start seeing social manifestations of some of these ideas. This is the what I called in the past the heroic age, where there weren't very many rules um, for modernism. This is where modernism was starting to develop and lay down some rules. And so we see the ideas of modernism um, coming to the fore in the American society of the 1920s. Now, this is not to say that everybody suddenly changed. You can find, in fact, more people who did not adopt the ideas of the 1920s than you can find who did adopt the ideas of the 1920s. Remember, historians look principally at change over time, but we have to always remember that that consistency over time is even more important. That's what some philosophers have called the dead hand of the past, is when they emphasize that consistency. Nevertheless, we start seeing new ideas, and we start seeing a big change in Americans' philosophy about what constituted the good life, how people were supposed to live, what constituted right living, and what constituted wrong living. Mass society and mass culture emerged in the 1920s with the mass consumption economy. We talk here then about automobiles and radios spreading this mass economy, and automobiles became inexpensive enough that many people who before could not afford them were able to afford them. And wages went up, at least nominally wages went up in the mid-1920s. And so we see the spread of the automobile. We also see the spread of radio, as well as the mainstreaming of mass entertainments like movies, the mainstreaming of mass entertainments like blood sports and like competitive sports. We also see the standardization of culture, the breakdown of regional differences. With radio, with automobiles, with other transportation links, with the movies, and with magazines that had arisen as a major cultural force in the 19 teens, all of these things shortened the distance between American regions and broke down regional identities. As the radio talked with one voice, then Americans began to lose their regional accents. Yeah, it's not real prominent at first, but over time, the constant talking from one place began to push out regional accents. And why did this occur? Well, it's because most of the entertainment industry, most of the radio industry, most of the movies, most of the magazines were produced in New England or in Southern California and were produced in cities. So we see urbanism as an important manifestation of society and of the modernist temper in the 1920s. So let's talk about urbanism for just a second. We'll intermingle this with standardized culture as well. For the first time in 1920, the census captured that the urban population was larger than the rural population. Now, an urban area for the U.S. Census was a place of 2,500, that's 2,500 people in an identified area. So we would think of that as a tiny little town, but the census did not and does not. And so using that relatively low standard, then we find that cities began to grow and to become the majority population. And cities were also the point at which the locus of these new cultural industries like radio, advertising, movies, most corporations, they spread not only a standardized culture, but a cityfied culture. And we can see this in the conglomeration of the entertainment industry, which was new in the 1920s. For example, almost all radio networks were housed or headquartered in New York City. That doesn't mean that they broadcast specifically from New York City, but the headquarters of the networks were in New York City. Now, you can find, like in Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, occasional radio stations out in the middle of nowhere. But that's mostly nonsense. If you find a radio station in the middle of nowhere in the 1920s, it did not have the range to actually get to people who owned radios, nor did it have a market that its advertisers would sell to. So it did not last very long. If you saw a radio station in the middle of nowhere, that middle of nowhere was right next to a town. Radio stations were commercial enterprises. They did not exist in a vacuum. They had to have a market. And they got boilerplate, just like newspapers did. Things that were produced elsewhere that they bought and they broadcast. And often they were connected in radio networks. The movie industry developed in New York City. And, you know, radio writers, movie writers, they all write about what they know, and they were right there physically in those cities. So cities became important culturally and began to spread cityfied culture through these avenues of communication. The large circulation magazines were headquartered in a few cities. Augusta, Maine, for example, during the Progressive era in 1920s, was home of 17 magazines, not 17 magazines, 17 distinct magazines, some of which had circulations over 2 million people. And these are things you don't see anymore. I mean, they blipped up. They were really popular, literary magazines, basically stories. And then they went away because the style changed. But Augusta, Maine had to build a separate post office just to handle the magazine publishing that was going on in that town. It's just one of those odd things that occurred. And in these markets, we find the competition for the least common denominator in order to spur a mass consumption of the goods and services being offered by advertisers. This is very different than niche marketing that we might call boutique marketing today. So a mass consumption economy developed. Well, on the high end of the economy, on the high end of culture, we find a fairly distinct set of things going on in the 1920s and because of early modernism. I'm sorry, I think I've gotten ahead of myself. Let me back up one slide. Okay. What I didn't talk about was youth culture, and I apologize. There was a distinctive middle class and upper class youth culture that emerged. An emphasis not on the wisdom of age, but on the vitality of youth. This was the height of a developing idea over the previous 30 years called the culture of informality, which replaced the high Victorians with a much, the stuffiness of the high Victorians with a much more body, you might say, culture during the 1900s and the 19-teens, and then the grandchildren of those stuffy Victorians, the children of those Edwardians, then took it another step further in informality and bodiness into the 1920s. And this was partly due to the disillusionment of the post-war generation. The war really impacted the psyche of the generation. We see the development of what's called the Jazz Age. And we see things like changes in courtship patterns. That is the creation of dating without an intention to marry. This was something new in the 20th century.
We see a lengthening adolescence. People retained their immaturity. They're being sheltered. They're not being thrown out to the on their own wiles into their into their 20s. We see a new style and a new entertainment culture. We see the flapper here with her bow. Now look at this illustration here. And sometimes illustrations are even better than photographs because they get at the central issue in a stereotype. The flapper here, obviously young, she has bobbed her hair. She is much more athletic and at the same time more boyish. This is the era in which the brassiere makes its real appearance as an accessory of women's fashion, and it is not, as in the 1950s or in our recent years, to emphasize the bust line. It is to suppress the bust line. We see the flapper whose mothers were aghast at showing knees. Now, the flapper's mothers might have been willing to show ankles, but they did not want to show knees. And here you're seeing the tops of this flapper's stockings. And yet, who is she dancing with? An older man, a bald man, not a young beau, but an older man in tux and tails. And see, bell-bottoms aren't just specific to the 1960s. Dancing with her, obviously a part of her life. They are not looking to get married. In addition to the flapper and her beau, who became cultural icons, we see the loss of innocence and informality becoming themes in the culture. Modern dance emerged along with modern musical forms like jazz. And these modern musical forms and modern dance are impassioned rather than elevating or inspiring. They are urban-based, they're hedonistic, they seem to be sexual, and for mainstream white culture, and mainstream culture was lily white, they were these new urban forms of music and dance came from the black neighborhoods, came from black culture. And this was part of the moral problem that many critics of modernism brought to bear. There is that racial overtone in criticisms of the culture of the 1920s. We also see in this youth culture a reaction to prohibition. That is, this is the era from 1920 until 1934 was the era of prohibition, when it was against federal law to sell intoxicating beverages. So we have a flaunting of that law in bootlegging and the speakeasy. Nipping illegal alcohol became part of the youthful rebellion culture. It spawned significant illegal industries in cities and in rural areas, moonshining, bootlegging, the speakeasy, and the automobile as part of bootlegging and the speakeasy became an important social icon. It shortened distances between regions and between country and city, but it lengthened distances between family members and heightened individualism. All of this is part of this youth culture. Well, like I said a minute ago, there was also a high culture of the 1920s, and it has contradictory roots. We'll look at this a little more thoroughly. Much music, art, and literature of the time drew on American rather than European inspirations. For example, we see in music the development of jazz, which is an authentic African-American music that many scholars argue began specifically in New Orleans. In orchestral music, we find Aaron Copland devising American symphonies. And you know Aaron Copland. You have heard Aaron Copland. Anytime you listen to television and you see the beef, it's what's for dinner commercial, the music that symphonic, rousing music playing in the background is Aaron Copland's Rodeo, at least the opening bars of Rodeo. In art, in graphic art, particularly painting, we see Benton and O'Keeffe. They are a reaction to the commercial culture that is developing. They're a reaction to hedonism, sometimes even an exponent of hedonism, and of World War I itself, as are many of the authors who we come to know from this era, like H.L. Mencken, who was a brutal satirist, Sinclair Lewis, F. Scott Fitzgerald, and his wife Zelda, who was from Montgomery, Alabama, and who is the model of the flapper. John Dos Passos, who was a brutal critic of American institutions, and of course Ernest Hemingway. Let's look at some visuals here. In music, we see developing after 1900 authentic American musical styles, jazz and its precursor ragtime coming out of the African American community. And you see some of the big ragtimers and jazzers here. Jelly Roll Morton in the upper left, the King Oliver Creole Band in the center, Duke Ellington looking very dapper, coming out of the Harlem Renaissance in the 1920s. On the lower left, Louis Armstrong, a very young Louis Armstrong in this picture in the middle on the bottom, and on the right, Aaron Copland, composing music, if you look very closely, by candlelight. That happens to be a 1946 image, but just imagine him as a younger guy. Here we see Benton's Parks, the circus, the Klan, and the press, a large mural drawing on American themes for his paintings. And then you see Georgia O'Keeffe's, that's Thomas Benton. You see Georgia O'Keeffe's Street, New York, #1 in 1926. She moved out to New Mexico after a while and tended to paint very, very tight close-ups of flowers like calla lilies. And then in the among writers, we see Ernest Hemingway at the top, John Dos Passos in the center, the satirist Mencken in the bottom, and both of the Fitzgeralds in the center. These folks wrote about what they knew of corruption and dissipation and horror. And I don't mean that they wrote horror stories. They wrote of the existential horror of life after and during war, and of the existential angst of this era. Now Mencken did not. Again, he was a satirist rather than a literati. So this then concludes our discussion defining modernism and talking about some of its manifestations in the 1920s. And thank you very much for your attention.